Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our final webinar of this fiscal year, Enrolling Refugee Children in U.S. Schools. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started today. First off, if you have troubleshooting during this presentation, please use the chat pod on the right-hand side of the screen, or you can email info@brycs.org. The webinar will be recorded and archived, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email with that recording, with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and any supplemental material that our presenters mentioned today. During the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of today's presentation, also please use the chat pod on the right to submit your questions. And if we do not get to your question, we'll be sure to post that and respond to that on BRYCS blog. Finally, at the close of today's presentation, you'll be redirected to a very short evaluation. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. It helps us as we design and determine topics for our upcoming webinars. So without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters to you today. First, we have Jamie Duckett. Jamie Duckett is the Children's Service Specialist at U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And she's got expertise in immigrant and refugee youth, including the areas of education and integration, and she's also a licensed clinical social worker. We also have Kate Walker from Catholic Charities Atlanta. She's been with them for almost 7 years, teaching parenting ESL to refugee parents and supporting them as they navigate the American school system. Before becoming the manager of refugee support services, providing school-related support services for both refugee parents and youth. Currently, as Catholic Charities of Atlanta's Director of Performance and Strategic Initiatives, she has worked with districts all over the state of Georgia and has partnered with schools as they strive to meet the needs of all of their students. Finally, we have Margaret McDonald, a BRYCS consultant. She's worked on refugee, immigrant, and trafficked children's issues for 15 years and has run a national outreach and education program on child trafficking, conducted program planning and evaluation for services to refugee and trafficked children, and provides training and technical assistance on services to these youth. She has also worked with specialized refugee foster care programs and written on patterns and trends in the resettlement of unaccompanied refugee children into the U.S. and conducted research on the issue of child trafficking. So thank you all for being here today and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Jackie. This is Jamie, and I just want to go over our learning objectives for today's presentation. Today we hope that you guys will be informed of some of the challenges that refugee children and families have when they enroll in the U.S. Public schools. We also hope that today you will also learn the current U.S. laws regarding school enrollment in order to address some of these potential challenges. And then we also hope that we will be providing you with some best practice recommendations on how your community can best assist refugee children enrolling in schools. So we're going to start off with looking at a couple of examples of some of the challenges that refugee and immigrant children have when enrolling in school. So kind of keep these cases in mind as to how you can help them as we go throughout the presentation.
So this is Margaret. I'm going to describe Omar. Omar is a 17-year-old Somali refugee who's just arrived in the U.S. from a refugee camp in Kenya. He's currently living with his aunt's family, who do not have legal guardianship. His aunt attempts to enroll him in school. However, Omar appears to have minimal formal education, speaks little English, and does not have his birth certificate. And we'll likely be referring back to these cases as we talk through different issues related to school enrollment. So just keep them in mind.
Okay, and this is Kate, and I'm going to talk about Evelyn. Evelyn is a 13-year-old girl who fled gang violence in Guatemala and after apprehension in the U.S. was released to her mother, who's undocumented, and she herself has only arrived in the U.S. 6 months ago. Evelyn's mother is currently renting out a bedroom in a friend's home, and when Evelyn's mother attempts to enroll her into the local school, she doesn't have any previous school records. Her mom doesn't have any proof of residency, and so she's facing those challenges. So keep Omar and Evelyn in mind as we're going through this presentation, and I'm sure some of you have very similar cases that you've dealt with.
Hey, thank you, ladies. So for migrant families and children, one of the greatest challenges in the U.S. can be enrolling children in the local public school system. They may have trouble gathering the requested documentation, may be discouraged from enrolling due to language barriers or their age, or may be denied enrollment if their caregiver is not a parent or legal guardian. Fortunately, there are some protections for migrant children attempting to enroll in school. So now we're going to discuss some of the different enrollment processes or policies that may be beneficial in helping enroll these children in school. So a Dear Colleague letter from the U.S. Department of Education was issued in May 2014 after the influx of unaccompanied children arriving to the U.S. in order to provide school districts guidance on ensuring equal access for all children to public schools regardless of their immigration status. This guidance requests that public elementary and secondary schools are ensuring enrollment processes are consistent with the law and fulfill their obligation to provide all children, no matter their background, equal access to an education under the Plyler versus Doe, and also provides frequently asked questions as well as recommendations. And we also, just to let you know, at the end there's a link to access the Dear Colleague letter as well as the frequently asked questions. So in order to provide you with some basic background, Plyler versus Doe of 1982 indicates that states may not deny access to a basic public education to any child residing in the state, whether they are present in the U.S. legally or otherwise. Therefore, school districts cannot ask a student or family about their immigration status, as it is unnecessary to establish residency in a school district. School districts may not bar a student from enrolling if they lack a birth certificate, and providing Social Security numbers is voluntary. The Dear Colleague letter continues to emphasize Plyler versus Doe and the need for flexibility in accepting documents from parents to prove a child's age and to show that a child resides within a school's attendance area, explaining in further detail that undocumented or non-citizen status of a student or his or her parent or guardian is irrelevant to that student's entitlement to an elementary or secondary public education, and that they may not require certain documents such as a parent's state-issued driver's license, where such a requirement would prevent a student from enrolling because of his or her parent's immigration status. Districts may not request information with the purpose or result of denying access to public school on the basis of race, color, or national origin. It also recommends that schools should review their list of documents that can be used to establish residency and ensure that any required documents would not unlawfully bar or discourage a student who is undocumented or whose parents are undocumented from enrolling or attending school. So some permissible documents that can be used to establish residency could be phone and water bills or lease agreements. It also reminds schools that districts should not bar a student from enrolling in its schools because the child lacks a birth certificate or has records indicating a foreign place of birth. Districts cannot deny enrollment to a student if they or their parent or guardian choose not to provide a Social Security number. If one is requested, the school will need to inform that the disclosure is voluntary. They need to inform why they are seeking that information and then explain to the parent or guardian how it will be used. And this request must be uniformly applied to all students and not in a selective manner to a specific group of students. The Dear Colleague letter also pointed out that homeless children and youth often do not have the documents ordinarily required for school enrollment, such as proof of residency or birth certificates. A school selected for a homeless child must immediately enroll the homeless child, even if the child or the child's parents or guardian is unable to produce the records normally required for enrollment.
Okay, so that leads to the McKinney-Vento Act, which is not specific to foreign-born or immigrant students, but is relevant to this population. It defines Homelessness is any person who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So the McKinney-Vento Act, it's another policy that can be used when assisting children to enroll in school. It ensures educational rights and protections for children and youth experiencing homelessness, and it applies to all school-aged children and youth. So we talked about the definition of homelessness. That includes children and youth who are sharing the housing of other persons, whether it's because of loss of housing, economic hardship, or some other similar reason. It would include living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, etc. Children or youth who have a primary nighttime residence that's a public or private place that's not normally a place used for sleeping or for accommodating human beings. So it includes cars, parks, public spaces, and so on. The McKinney-Vento Act also includes services for unaccompanied youth, so that would include youth who are not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. Not all of the unaccompanied children, say, who were formerly in the custody of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, would necessarily fall under the category of unaccompanied youth. So it's going to be sort of case by case. Regardless of whether the children are accompanied or unaccompanied, though, if they fall under the homelessness definition, they can receive services under the McKinney-Vento Act. So that is our next slide. So the McKinney-Vento Act defines the rights of homeless children, and again, this is particularly relevant to the population of children we're considering because it does include people who are doubled up. And there may be kind of a case-by-case decision-making process on whether they qualify under McKinney-Vento, but there are many children that we work with that ought to qualify. So if they do qualify, they are eligible for immediate enrollment, even if they don't have all of their paperwork. So even if they don't have medical records or proof of residency, if they don't have immunization records or birth certificates, if they don't have their former school records or proof of guardianship, they are still entitled to immediate enrollment if they are considered homeless. And once they're enrolled, then the adults involved can continue trying to obtain the relevant paperwork. But this allows students to get into school rather than waiting for weeks or months while their paperwork is getting in order. These children get access to all of the school's programs and services on the same basis as all other students. So it includes special education, nutrition programs, extracurricular activities, and so on. And school systems are required to have a homeless liaison. And that person ought to be in communication with local schools. It's possible there may even be someone designated within individual schools, but the district itself ought to have one. And that homeless liaison is required to assist with things like getting immunizations and medical records for students, and can also help when working through enrollment questions with schools. The homeless liaison can also help when there is a dispute over which school a child should be attending. That can be particularly relevant for kids who have moved around a fair amount because of their housing status. There is a fair amount of flexibility built into the McKinney-Vento Act for school enrollment, and when there is a dispute, kids are required to be enrolled in the school they're seeking to be enrolled in while that dispute is worked out. So that's sort of a quick summary of McKinney-Vento and how it's probably relevant for some groups of kids in the population that we're referring to.
And we did want to point out that, front line or front office staff might not be familiar with these different policies. So they might not be aware of McKinney-Vento or that their district does have a homeless liaison or the Plyler versus Doe as far as immigration status questioning. So we just, as we go on, we're going to talk about best practices and recommendations, but of course, working with the district, because it might just be that it's someone else that can connect you to the homeless liaison or point you in the right direction. Of course, the State Department of Education is really helpful because they can work with school districts to remind them of these mandates. And then also there's the option of the Federal Department of Education has an Office of Civil Rights. So if there is continued issue and you've gone up the chain of command and found it, there is also that avenue.
Okay. So now that we share with you some national school policies that provide basic assistance with school enrollment, let's discuss some tips on how to assist families with those challenges identified in the beginning. So during this time, while we provide some best practice recommendations, if you have any examples of best practices or recommendations that you would like to share, please add them to the chat box on your right. So in some cases, migrant children may be living with caregivers other than their parents, such as like family friends, aunts and uncles, older siblings. And in some states, they have consent laws which allow relative caregivers to enroll children in schools, while other states do not have laws. And so therefore it's kind of hard for other caregivers besides parents to enroll the child in school. So, however, when proof of guardianship or legal custody is not available, it can delay a child from enrolling in school. And so in these situations, caregivers may need to work with the schools to determine whether the school would accept an affidavit or other assurance of the relationship between the child and the caregivers. So here's some ways that some states have enacted in order to allow children to enroll in public schools. So the first one we have is residency requirements. And so what the residency requirements is, they ensure that they require that the child is enrolled in a school district for a legitimate purpose. So that means not solely just to attend school. Like they're there because they are living with the family or they, have daycare or something in that residence. So this proof is to prevent families from abusing the school system by shopping for a particular school and having their children live in that district during the school week or school year solely to attend that school. Okay. There's also educational consent laws, which generally allow caregivers without legal custody or guardianship of the children to complete an affidavit under penalty of perjury that they are the primary caregivers of the children, which then allows them to enroll the child in public school. Some states have also found ways to ensure that children being raised by others, what happens is they can attend the public school by having the child's residency follow them rather than their parents. So pretty much what this means is that wherever a child lives is his or her legal residence for purposes of attending school. So Rhode Island's law gives an example of this by stating, like, in cases where a child has no living parent, has been abandoned by his or her parents, or when parents are unable to care for their child on account of parental illness or family breakup, the child shall be deemed to be a resident of the city or town where the child lives with his or her legal guardian, natural guardian, or other person acting in loco parentis, so in place of the in place of the parent. Go ahead. So
another example of this is, I believe, in Texas. I think it's Texas that does this, to say if a child is receiving care after school by the grandparents, for example, and so it's the grandparents that are primarily caring for them for the hours after school, they can go to the school that would be zoned for their grandparents' residence, even if that's not where they sleep at night with their parents. So some school districts or school systems and states have come up with some flexibility that will help serve some of the kids in these situations.
Some other guardianship tips are power of attorney law. So this allows for The majority of states in D.C. Allow parents to complete a form or handwritten document which states that the type of authority they are giving the caregivers. So these states typically allow the power of attorney to be designated for 6 months to a year. Then you also have a surrogate parent, and this is under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so what it states is for caregivers who have children who are eligible to receive services for disabled children under the Disabilities Education Act, such as early intervention services for children birth to 3, preschool services, or special education services for grades kindergarten through 12. What they can do is can request to become a surrogate parent, which allows the individual acting in the place of a biological or adoptive parent with whom the child lives or is who is legally responsible for the child's welfare, or a surrogate parent has been appointed in accordance. An example of this is when I worked in foster care. We had at times the children who were in special services, their foster parent was signed on as a surrogate parent, and therefore they were able to make the decisions on like the IEPs and any other things, and so they were also able to help enroll the child in school.
So these are all things that you can look into to see whether any of these more flexible options exist in your school district, or whether you can advocate if they don't exist, if you can advocate for any of them to be put into place, that they've worked in other states and may be able to help in the states where they're not in place.
Right. And so one of our last tips in regards to guardianship is for those unaccompanied, undocumented children who have been released from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, Divisions of Children's Services. So once those children have been released from ORR, DCS custody, they are provided with a verification of release form, which includes language from the U.S. Department of Education regarding the child's right to enroll in a public school. And so it states on this form that they have a right to enroll in school. And so this, in some locations, the verification of release or the sponsor's care agreement that they sign in order to get the child released to them may be acceptable substitutes for formal guardianship paperwork. Children and their caregivers can also be referred to their country's, their country's nearest consular office to request assistance in obtaining documentation from their country of origin to validate identity or relationship.
So for placement, there's also some tips and some different programs happening around the country that we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of. And it's really important to familiarize yourself with the different processes with the different districts that you work with. So some districts have centralized enrollment centers. That's like maybe an international welcome center or a newcomer center, and they're often the most helpful because the staff there are familiar with our families. They know refugee and immigrant families. They understand why they might not have birth certificates or transcripts might be missing. And they often do the initial screening, and so then they help with the grade placement, which we'll get into, but then they give the family paperwork and the family would take that to their assigned school. So then the assigned school doesn't have to do anything in those initial steps. We've had some local schools tell families, oh no, you can't enroll, you're missing certain things, but then they go to the centralized enrollment center and they're welcomed and told they can enroll. So it's always best to know what the district has set up and the best routes for your clients, or the best, points of contact. If you talk to this person, they know what's going on, whereas, maybe the front office initial staff might not. But just helping our families with those steps, because if they miss a step, it's often more roadblocks and challenges. We also wanted to talk about newcomer programs because they function as temporary stopovers for recently arrived immigrant and refugee students who have language limitations, maybe they have had interrupted or not formal education, they're not on their grade level, they don't know the familiarity with the U.S. school system yet, and then of course the social emotional issues that might come up as far as trauma and self-esteem and things like that. So these programs operate under the assumption that these students need a period of adjustment, not only to the education system, but also to the U.S. social environment. And they have all sorts of different creative programs, and they partner with sometimes with community organizations to provide orientations to school and their communities, specialized curriculums, access to other supportive services, individualized attention, teacher training, the teachers know these students, and multicultural, education and sensitivity. So here locally we have a district, and they have a newcomers International Center, and it has intensive ESOL programs for students in these categories. And so for those students up to 6th grade age, the program is shorter term, and so students might, test out and transition to their assigned school. But the middle school program serves students really up to the time when they would age out of the system here. And so classes follow middle school standards. They have to do that for the state requirements, but many students are actually on much lower grade levels. So teachers teach the core subjects but with ESOL methods. So they have added some classes so that students can earn some credit before they transition to high school. So, we've heard of all different creative programs around the country that districts are doing, and so these are really great to be aware of and to help your local district to maybe put some of these in place if it's a need. So we're going to get into placement and some of the challenges that exist, but then, some ways to mitigate the challenges. So, if your district has a newcomer program or a centralized enrollment center, sometimes they can help for students that have missing transcripts, or maybe they have the transcript but they can't get them yet, and so it's always tricky, what grade should we place them in, and if they're not on grade level for their age, that's a challenge because you don't want older students in grades that might not be appropriate. So for students who arrive with incomplete or missing transcripts, policies really vary greatly among states and even school districts with respect to awarding credits. Some school districts have developed forms to help rebuild the transcripts of the foreign-born students, which is taking the students' or parents' report of what classes were taken and when, while others don't award credit based on their report. So it's good to talk with your district, your State Department of Education to see, what they can be doing. But many of our students here, don't have transcripts, or if they do, maybe the transcripts are old or incomplete. And so school districts, usually can't place students in a higher grade without proof that they have the required credits to be there. So like I said, sometimes they help rebuild credits. Some districts have where the students can test into a higher grade level. For example, if they pass all of the 9th grade end of course tests, then they can go into the 10th grade. Where they don't have these options, students usually have to start out in lower grade levels, which would be maybe in 9th grade, or when they're in lower grades, then just the grade level that's closest to their age. So a big challenge for us has been with our older children, our older youth that have an extra hurdle. Here locally, if older students aren't at grade level, then districts are hesitant to put them in 9th grade because they anticipate that the student will age out before they can graduate. And so here, if a student ages out without graduating, it counts against the school as a dropout. It's also challenging because maybe the students aren't even on the 9th grade level yet and having trouble keeping up academically, of course, as well as socially. But many districts don't have like extra intensive support, so it can make it hard in the classroom, of course, for the staff, the teachers, but also their classmates. So sometimes the districts, recommend like adult education or GED programs, but that's not always viable or preferred since some of adult educational programs are full or have waiting lists. They may only have classes for a few hours a week with a short semester or term. They might not provide transportation. Sometimes they require documents. So if you are in immigration proceedings and you're undocumented, that wouldn't even be an option, or they might cost money. And some of our students aren't even ready to take the GED or even a GED prep course yet. So these students can really receive academic as well as non-academic benefits from being enrolled in full-time schooling, such as more structured and supervised hours in the classroom, tutoring help, free or reduced lunch, socialization with peers, mentoring, all those sorts of things. And state laws really vary regarding the ages of children for guaranteed schooling. The Education Commission of the States provides a state-by-state breakdown on age requirements as outlined in state codes. Older teens may benefit from being connected with advocates to overcome some of the barriers to school enrollment for those who are eligible based on age.
Okay, so I wanted to sort of step back and talk about some bigger picture suggestions for school districts or schools themselves, including things like having community conversations or other forums that schools and that can involve schools, community partners, families to discuss issues related to immigrant youth, to also ensure that families are being provided with interpreters. So school districts ought to be following all the federal language access laws, make sure that families who need interpretive services are getting them. And to sort of proactively try to ensure a level of cultural competency or cultural proficiency among the staff in school systems. So incorporating that into professional development, encouraging teachers, school administrators, front office staff to continue professional development and become aware of issues related to children born in other countries. Bilingual family liaisons can be tremendously helpful in schools, in actually directly in schools or across school districts if they need to be shared among schools. And finally, since all school districts are required to have a homeless liaison, it is helpful for the schools themselves and for those of you working with and advocating for children in the school systems to reach out and get to know the homeless liaison in your district. Talk sort of preemptively before you have a student to enroll about what sort of conversations you need to be having and what to expect at the local school level. And then for school districts, it's really crucial to make sure that information is trickling down from the centralized offices to the actual school system staff, which is, of course, easier said than done.
Okay, so before we go, we referenced in the beginning the two students, Omar and Evelyn. And so what we want to do is, before we kind of finalize our chat, is kind of go back to their cases and just kind of give like recommendations as to what we would do for each case. So for Margaret, you were talking about Omar in the beginning, and he was a Somali refugee who was living with his aunt who did not have a legal guardianship, and she was trying to enroll him in a school, but he, of course, had minimal formal education, he had little English, and he didn't have his birth certificate. So how do you think, like based on what we discussed today, what is the process that you would try and go through to enroll him in school?
Well, so I was going to reference Evelyn, but I can skip over to Omar. I think Omar hits a lot of the issues that we've raised here, and I would also like to ask those of you listening on the webinar to chime in with either solutions that you've had or things that you've had success with, or questions that have really stumped you in cases like Omar's and Evelyn's. I think one of the things that jumps out at me is that his aunt does not have legal guardianship, and that may not be a hurdle at all. It simply depends on the school system and the knowledge of the people in the front office at the school that he goes to enroll in. And that's where knowledge of your state's or your county's guardianship requirements is really crucial. The minimal formal education and minimal English skills also would speak to the value of some of the programs that Kate talked about, and the need to ensure that he's getting additional assistance. He is an older teen and may well face a school or a school system that doesn't want to enroll him into high school, but would rather move him to an adult education program. And he may even find that his aunt thinks that's the best thing to do, just work on your English. And I guess that's something that needs to be decided with the family, but for many youth, they really benefit from the access to socialization, to a formal education setting, to being enrolled in a high school in which they are actually attending classes all day as opposed to an adult education program that may be just a few hours in the evenings, maybe not even every day. So I think Omar is probably someone who would need some advocacy pushing the school to enroll him. Most states have a maximum age at which they are required to provide education to schools, to students in the district. And so advocating for any youth who is under that maximum age to get the services that they're eligible for would probably be beneficial.
Right. Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, now I was thinking about Evelyn, so I agree with everything for Omar, and of course it's district specific and making sure the family, is involved, because it might be that his aunt, doesn't know about, these options or the benefits, and so really working with the families to understand that is important.
Okay. So then moving on to Evelyn. So again, just to kind of recap, Evelyn is a 13-year-old girl with her mother, who is also undocumented and who just arrived to the U.S. herself 6 months ago, renting a room from a family friend, and does not have proof of residency, and Evelyn does not have any previous school documents. So Kate, how would you go about helping Evelyn?
Well, I was just thinking, of course, we talked about McKinney-Vento, and so looking at, those options and talking to the homeless liaison in the school district. A lot of districts where we are, they have an affidavit of residency, so if the family could have the person that Evelyn's mother is renting from sign it, then that would be enough proof for residency. So it kind of depends, on what the district allows, but definitely looking at the McKinney-Vento homeless services as well. I think as far as the, if she has the ORR letter, a lot of places that would be sufficient, but then if not, trying to work with the district and of course with the State Department of Education, what are some options if sometimes we have schools that say, no, you have to have legal guardianship, and so really going back to, the central district office, but also the State Department of Education, just to talk through and referencing, the information from the Federal Department of Education is important. And then, as far as grade placement, that would be up to the district, but really advocating for Evelyn to get the supportive services that she needs, the ESOL, and then working with the family for other supportive services too.
Okay, thank you. And Margaret, do you have anything to add?
Okay. No, I think Kate covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this actually kind of concludes our presentation for today. So again, if you have any questions during this time, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Also, if you have any best recommendations or experiences that you had that have worked for you, we would appreciate your feedback in the chat box, because I'm sure there's others that may have had these issues and, information or, procedures that, your colleagues have done would help. So some of the additional resources that we discussed are in this slide, and again, the slide will be sent out to you, but there's the U.S. Department of Education, a Dear Colleague letter that we referenced, as well as the question and answers for state school districts and parents. And then there's also the fact sheet for information on the rights of all children to enroll in school.
And I would love to hear from any of you who have actually used or tried to use the McKinney-Vento Act to enroll students. I think it's one of those laws that's not well enough known and I think is not well understood at the local level, and so may or may not be helpful depending on the knowledge level of the people involved working with kids.
And then some more additional resources we have, the U.S. Department of Education, so of course they have an abundance of resources, but Educational Services for Immigrant Children. They also have a resource guide supporting undocumented youth in secondary and post-secondary settings. And then there's the National Center for Homeless Education, Enrolling Children and Youth Experiencing Homelessness. So as we mentioned, some of the undocumented children may be able to follow under this, as well as some of those refugee and immigrant children who are living with relatives.
So Veronica Hill has posted a question about high-functioning older students arriving without transcripts. Which states have the more generous policy of allowing report by parents or testing out of grades? Is this state or district policy? How do we move towards advocating for this in our state or district? Very discouraging for students who are seniors in their country to put into ninth grade and so will age out before max age. Yeah, and I think that's not uncommon as an issue. Kate, do you want to talk about your experience in Georgia?
Well, I think, it's definitely a challenge. Like you said, it's not uncommon. And really, here, one of our local school districts has started doing like a stakeholder meeting, and so we get together as service providers along with district staff and principals and really looking at, what's the need and how can we address it. So, really working with the district around, okay, how can we get creative? And there are sometimes alternative high schools where students can continue even after their, that max age. But, locally sometimes that's a challenge because even to get into the alternative high school, you would have to have a certain number of credits. And so for our students that, might not be enough time for them to do that. So really working with the district to figure out what are some ways we can come up with that they can, maybe what they're talking about is a pilot program to start with, and then moving it to something where it could be taken to the board and a decision could be made that they could have these different programs, and then they wouldn't have to address the state age because, some districts can continue serving them even after they age out compared to the state age, but it's a district-by-district decision. So working with the district, here's the need, this is what we're finding, what can we come up with to see if it will work.
Thank you, Kate. And then while others are typing some of the continuing additional resources, so we have the newcomer program helping immigrant students succeed in U.S. schools, international transcripts. So this is, Kate was talking before about rebuilding transcripts. So this was an example of DECO, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong.
DeKalb.
Sorry, thank you. DeKalb County, who created a transcript where they would take the parents' report of classes and they would try and rebuild a transcript. There's also the birth dates of refugee children and the impact on grade placement. So this is a frequently asked questions on how can we be sure that the child is the age that they say they are without having documents that prove the birth date. And then the last link is the school attendance age limit. So as we mentioned before, some schools allow children to go, or we recommend that you advocate for a child to go up to attend school up to the age limit that the states allow. And so this link here gives you the age limits for the states, for the different states.
So that, Kristen, I see that Kristen Larcher has posted a question about that. Max age out, different state by state, it is. Yeah. And what's the oldest age a student can enroll into high school. So the school attendance age limits link should help with that. There are 1 or 2 states where the maximum age a state is required to provide education is something like 17, but most of them are 19 or 20, some are 21. Mm-hmm. And I think the oldest age student can enroll into high school is going to vary by location. So Roberto Gonzalez. Oh wait,
can I go back to
Sure,
that? So one of the things I just want to point out is, in regards for the max of the oldest age, you want to be careful with that, because sometimes I know the schools, the limit is because of the child is in special education services. So you want to make sure if that max out age is specific to those receiving special education services or those in the general education population. So just be aware of that when you're looking into that.
Yeah.
And so Roberta's question is about helping a student trying to get an ID who was born in the U.S. and is age 15, but raised in Guatemala. So I don't know, Kate, is this something you've run into, a U.S.-born student but raised elsewhere?
Yeah, this one would get tricky, because if they were born in the United States, it would be trying to get proof of that. So, getting a birth certificate or, a copy of that from where they were born. And then, going through that process as far as getting an ID. The legal guardianship here, sometimes the schools help families to understand, and so how that happens, and so they might refer them just to our local courthouse to fill out some paperwork to start that process, or like you were mentioning, the power of attorney, like some jurisdictions do that. So then it would be, kind of finding out locally what your rules are, and if she could get an ID on her own at age 15, or if she would have to have someone above to help her with that.
And it may also be possible to get an affidavit from the mother, or to work with the Guatemalan consulate to.
Yes, the consulates are usually very helpful. Yeah. Good point.
And so then Cynthia has asked, my high school district does grade placement based on credits completed. We have a 17-year-old ninth grader. Do you have any opinions on that and suggestions on how to grade place psych high school students?
And for those of you who don't know, the SIFE stands for Students with Interrupted Formal Education.
Okay. So, Kate?
Well, I would say that just really depends on the district, and so, here we've tried to meet with the people that make those decisions. How do you figure out grade placement? What information do you need? What can we help the families to obtain or not obtain? But we have that a lot where they're ninth graders and they're 17 or older, just because the district has their own criteria and the students can't meet it. And so that's when those other programs such as Newcomer Center or intensive ESOL programs are really helpful, because even at 17, that student might not be on a ninth grade level, but the district is trying to get them in a ninth grade so they can get credits and move forward to try to get their requirements for graduation. So I think just trying to meet with the registrars or the people at the centralized registration center and try to find out what their criteria is and then what the district is trying to do to address it. Because, you know, in our experience, the districts are trying to get everybody to the point of graduation. And so some districts have, you know, maybe there are alternative ways, or maybe it's not college prep diploma, but maybe it's some other, you know, kinds of career and readiness types of programs. But then kind of working with the district, you know, what are their plans, how are they going to get there, and then how can the community support? So can anybody offer a tutoring program, or can you connect with different things like that?
And I will also say that the BRYCS website, I don't know how many of you have used the resources on their site, but if you do a search for grade placement or SIFE and grade placement, there are a lot of resources on the BRYCS website on that topic, and that can give some insight into how other school districts handle this. And it looks like Jackie has just posted a link that I think will take you to some of those highlighted resources. In addition, I think earlier it was Veronica who asked about which states have more generous policies, and I don't know that, but we can look, and if we're able to find something useful that talks about specific states, we can post that on the BRYCS blog related to this topic. So there is also on the BRYCS website a link to the blog that we did on this topic that has some similar information, and you are also welcome to post questions there after this webinar. If you think of something later you want to ask, you can post it there, and the three of us on the webinar and the BRYCS staff will be monitoring that to see what we can offer in terms of answers to questions you have. So looking at Paige's question right now.
Paige just kind of gave some some information. Paige, would you like to put where you are from? But she says each school accepts and transcribes international transcripts, but we struggle with how to determine authenticity. For students who have no records but are performing at a high level, our district offers case-by-case special graduation requests for waivers. Case-by-case approval allows for advocacy for individuals, but there is definitely a concern for equity and consistency. Right. Okay.
And I would just add, I think that's true. You know, there are some districts who, you know, the student doesn't have an official transcript, but they have a report card, or they have, you know, some stuff kind of showing what classes they took. But I think it is definitely a concern for, you know, that authenticity and consistency, and I think districts really just try to do the best they can, and like you said, case by case to try to see, because I think it's just a challenge across the board.
Right. And then just to follow up, so Paige was from Anchorage, Alaska, and was an ELL high school counselor and now a refugee liaison for the district. So thanks, Paige. That's very informative, because again, it shows that, you know, if there's enough people advocating for these different children and everything, then there's ways to get around the system.
Yeah. So did anyone else have questions? It doesn't look like anyone's typing right now. Oh, Veronica Hill is typing. But yeah, we've got a couple more minutes, so if anyone else has additional questions or insights based on your experiences, we would love to hear them.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, or if you, we see someone typing, so we'll try and wait. But if you have other questions, again, like Margaret said, please feel free to go onto the blog and you can ask questions there, or you can email BRYCS, and we can, when we post this, we can post the different questions that were asked, or that are asked but we were not able to answer. So the one last question. I have one of my clients, this is from Raina. I have one of my clients, she is 14 and she should be placed at a high school. After I enrolled her at high school, her school's principal decided to transfer her to middle school because he thinks that would be for her education benefit and ultimately for her education progress. Do you think that moving a student to a less grade would really help a student?
I think that's probably going to depend on the student and on the school. So if she had started at the school and they decided that she was, after assessing her, that she was not going to be able to keep up, it may be in her interest to take a step back to a grade level that's more in line with her current knowledge level, rather than try and put her in the grade level that matches her age. So if she still has some catch-up work to do, she's probably better off doing that now than struggling for several years. And I don't know if anybody else anyone who's on the call has had experience with this. And we'd love to hear your input. I know that there are large ongoing conversations about, age and grade placement and social interactions and socialization. But from an education standpoint, it seems like if the school is trying to match her with her educational experience, that makes some sense.
And I would just add that, of course, it depends on the student, like Margaret said. I think, we've seen it go both ways, where maybe it really helped the student and they had that extra year to really adjust, and then they started in high school and they were much more prepared and better. And then we've had students where socially it just wasn't the best fit, and so we wondered maybe if it had been not the best decision. So we always really work with the families to understand their role, because parents can really advocate and make some pretty big decisions, if they disagree with what the principal would want in this case. So I think just helping the parents to be involved in that process, and the parents might say, like, yeah, we'd really want for her to get an extra year and to make friends before she's worried about passing classes, for graduation. But then sometimes families say, no, we're planning that she's going to have to be working soon and we want to get her, as far ahead as she can. So it just depends on the situation, I think.
Right, and it looks like Kirsten from Boise, Idaho, kind of said that too, just kind of reiterated that sometimes the refugee parents ask for a grade or more down. And it depends on many factors, and I agree with Kate that it depends on, one, like the maturity and development of the child, because and social interactions, because it may be beneficial to put a child in a lower grade where she can make friends acclimate to the new environment, as opposed to going to high school and having the several different classes, maybe not understanding English that well. You're just put in a totally different environment, so that at least dropping a grade below kind of prepares them for what's to come.
And especially in a school district where she's got time, she's not going to age out.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, much different.
Yeah. So that, again, that's going to conclude our presentation for today. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and if we can answer them, we will answer them later in the blog. So again, thank you for having us, and thank you for participating in our session today.
Thank you.